Human experiments can be crucial for scientific progress, but they must be conducted under strict ethical guidelines. Unfortunately, some experiments in the past spiraled out of control, leading to groups of people being exploited, sacrificed for mere curiosity, suffering severe mental strain, or even causing a nationwide dental health crisis. Join me as I take you on a journey to the past as we discuss some of the most inhumane human experiments ever conducted. During World War II, the Nazis conducted horrific medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners to further their ideology of racial superiority. These experiments included freezing experiments, infectious disease experiments, sterilization experiments, high-altitude tests, twin studies, and several other inhumane trials. All of these experiments were carried out on prisoners of war, often resulting in excruciating pain, permanent injury, or death. The purpose of these experiments was not medical advancement, but rather to support Nazi racial theories, with little regard for the suffering or humanity of the subjects involved. Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted twin studies at Auschwitz concentration camp, where he carried out a broad range of experiments on twins. Initially, he housed and fed them properly, which might have led one to believe he had a soft spot for twins. However, this was only a prologue to the horrors that awaited them, as he was merely preparing them for brutal experiments. One day, Mengele brought the twins into his laboratory and put them in separate places, tying the up, marking the start of his inhumane procedures. He began by injecting them with typhus, carefully noting how each twin responded to the disease. He also performed unnecessary amputations and transfused blood from one twin to the other without purpose. If one of the twins died during the experiment, Mengele would immediately murder the surviving twin and dissect both bodies to study the progression of organ decay. The most inhumane twin experiment he performed involved sewing two children together to create artificial conjoined twins. This procedure, horrifying in its aim, did not succeed for long. The children's wounds became infected, and they eventually died from gangrene. Their deaths, however, did not deter Mengele, as he viewed the loss of test subjects as a natural consequence of the gruesome path he had chosen. Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted another set of horrific experiments on individuals with dwarfism, as his primary interest was in studying genetic malformations. He spared a Jewish dwarf family from execution, but only to use them as subjects for his gruesome experiments. Mengele subjected each family member to intensive X-ray sessions, extracted their teeth to analyze genetic material, and drained so much blood from them that they often passed out. Unlike many of his previous victims, this family managed to survive the ordeal, and after their liberation, they provided accounts of the horrors they endured under Mengele's captivity. The Stanford Prison Experiment took place in 1971. The purpose of the study was to explore the psychology of human responses to captivity and its behavioral effects on both prisoners and authorities. Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist at Stanford University, along with a team of researchers and undergraduate volunteers, played the roles of inmates and guards. They stayed in a mock prison set up at Stanford University. One of the first observations was that the guards quickly adapted to their roles, stepping far beyond the predicted boundaries. Some of the guards began to exhibit sadistic tendencies, while many of the prisoners became deeply traumatized by the experiment. In fact, 2 prisoners had to be removed early to preserve their mental well-being. By the 6th day, Zimbardo observed that the guards had become excessively violent, and the inmates were experiencing significant psychological distress. He decided it was necessary to bring the experiment to an early end to prevent further harm. Around the 1930s, a pandemic took Sweden by surprise, and no, it wasn't caused by a deadly disease. The pandemic was fueled by sweets. All age groups in Sweden became addicted to candy as though it were a drug. This addiction left most people with cavities and tooth decay. Dentists were working tirelessly as they struggled to understand what had caused such a phenomenon. Back then, dental procedures were more experimental than precise, and little was known about proper dental care. As the dental crisis in the country escalated, the Swedish government realized it was time to seek a solution. Initially, fingers were pointed at candy makers, but they vehemently denied the accusations. With no concrete evidence, Swedish medical experts decided to conduct an experiment known as the Vipholm study, aimed at investigating the root cause of tooth decay from sugar consumption. Finding willing test subjects proved difficult, as the dangers of excessive candy consumption were now widely understood. Despite the challenges, the study, bankrolled by both the government and candy manufacturers, began in 1945. The experiment took place at the Vipholm Institute for the Intellectually Disabled. The government justified the use of these children, claiming it was a service to the nation. A total of 660 patients were subjected to this experiment. Initially, they were put on a diet consisting of vitamins, fluoride, and starch-light meals, without any additional sugary treats for the first 2 years of the study. At the end of this initial phase, 73% of the patients showed no new dental issues, leading to the approval of vitamins, fluoride, and starch as being beneficial to dental health. However, the next phase took a dark turn when the patients' diets were drastically changed to a strict sugar regimen, which included only snacks, sugary drinks, and sticky toffees designed to cling to the teeth. By 1949, around 10% of the patients had teeth in dire condition, all suffering from cavities and daily pain. Anyone who has experienced a toothache knows how unbearable the discomfort can be. However, this was not the outcome the candy companies had anticipated. In response, they conspired to suppress the results of this phase of the experiment. In 1953, the results were finally made public, and Sweden erupted in outrage. Curiously, though, the public was more focused on the harmful effects of sugar than on the unethical methods used to conduct the study. The name hints at something eerie, but it's slightly better than what you'd expect. It is still deeply unethical. The designer of this inhumane study was Wendell Johnson, an American scientist who worked at the University of Iowa in 1939. The aim of the study was to determine whether positive reinforcement could help cure stuttering in children, which might sound noble at first glance. However, there are two sides to every coin. The darker side of this study sought to explore whether stuttering could be induced in children through negative reinforcement. Johnson used orphans as his experimental subjects, enlisting 22 children between the ages of 5 and 15. These children were split into different groups based on how well they could speak. There were 4 groups in total. Group 1A consisted of 6 children with no speech defects who received praise for their fluent speech. Group 2A comprised 6 children who had no speech defects but were made to believe they were beginning to stutter and were told they needed to improve. Group 1B included 5 children who did stutter, but they were reassured that their stuttering was just a phase they would eventually outgrow. Lastly, Group 2B consisted of children who stuttered and were repeatedly criticized for their speech defects. The focus of the study was on Groups 2A and 1B, as they were key to Johnson's hypothesis on inducing and curing stuttering. While Johnson conceived the idea, it was a student, Mary Tudor, who was the instrument of his experiment. Her role was to follow a script written by Johnson and record the children's reactions. The children in Group 2A, who were wrongly told they were developing a stutter, suffered severe emotional distress and withdrew into themselves. Those in Group 1B, the children who stuttered but were given positive reinforcement, showed little change. However, the children in Group 2B, subjected to relentless criticism, had their self-esteem permanently damaged. This experiment serves as a stark reminder that belittling a child will only push them further into isolation and hinder their emotional development. This is an unethical human experiment that occurred from 1951 to 1974 at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. About 6 years after World War II ended, scientists and researchers were fixated on creating the next big breakthrough. In their pursuit, they ignored moral boundaries, leading them down dark and dangerous paths. The Nuremberg Code of 1947 had fully banned such human experiments, but desperation often disregards such limitations. During the Cold War, the need to compete with the Soviet Union drove scientists to disregard these restrictions by any means necessary. Prisoners at Holmesburg were subjected to a range of experiments under the disguise of medical and scientific testing, often being told these trials would help solve problems in their bodies or even modify their systems. In reality, these inmates were nothing more than human guinea pigs for the scientists. They tested everything from products like cosmetics and pills to harmful substances like corrosive chemicals. Many of these experiments were funded by large corporations, including Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical Company, and even the US Army. These experiments were framed as voluntary tests, offering prisoners little compensation as an incentive. But what can one expect when you dangle a faint glimmer of hope before a group of hungry, beaten, frustrated, and exhausted men? They become captives to your agenda. For as little as $2, these men subjected themselves to life-threatening procedures. Without meaningful alternatives, they accepted these terms, even when it meant risking their lives. Dr. Albert Kligman, a man who could only be described as a sinister scientist, saw the inmates not as human beings but as acres of skin, reducing their worth to mere flesh. He led some of the most grotesque experiments, including exposing inmates to sexually transmitted diseases, skin-blistering agents, radiation, psychoactive drugs, and carcinogenic chemicals. One of his most infamous experiments involved dioxins, which later played a role in the development of Agent Orange, a chemical weapon used during the Vietnam War. The researchers saw these men as mere lab rats to be tested and discarded, offering them pennies in return. One prisoner recalled being cut open, having gauze stuffed inside his body, and then being stitched back up. 10 days later, they removed the gauze, and he was handed $10. Was that small sum worth the risk to his life? By the 1970s, nearly all the inmates at Holmesburg had participated in these dangerous trials, eventually drawing the attention of the public to the prison's activities. The unethical and inhumane treatment of the inmates finally came under scrutiny. This project's aim was to conduct experiments on both humans and animals, subjecting them to gruesome conditions such as sensory deprivation, hypnosis, psychological manipulation, and the administration of LSD. The idea behind this project was to discover a method of controlling the human mind. The CIA carried out extensive experiments using LSD to weaken human resistance and extract information from their subjects. It didn't matter whether the subjects were military personnel or civilians. What mattered was finding out if the drug worked. Hypnosis was employed to try to induce amnesia, and sensory deprivation was used to isolate subjects and expose them to harsh conditions, such as placing them in sensory deprivation tanks. The goal of these tactics was to unlock alternate states of consciousness. During this time, they also developed undetectable methods of drug administration, such as using sprays. This unethical experiment, known as Project MKUltra, came to light in the 1970s through several secret investigations. The public's outrage led to the project's termination, and new laws were established to prevent the misuse of subjects in such a manner.